When Emperor Zhao died in 74 BC, he did not leave any sons to assume the throne. It was up to Huoguang, the acting regent, to select another member of the imperial clan to be the next ruler of China. Aside from Wudi's son, Liu Tzu, who had previously been discounted from assuming the throne because of his unruly lifestyle, Wudi's closest living descendant was his grandson, Liu He. Liu He, the king of Changyi, was the son of Liu Bo, the son of Wudi and Lady Li, who had died in 88 BC. There were also other grandsons, the sons of Liu Dan, the king who had twice plotted a coup during the reign of Xuandi and had been executed in 80 BC. But these grandsons had been demoted to commoner status because of their father's misdeeds, so they were ineligible for the throne. As well as these, there was a great-grandson. Liu Bingyi was the grandson of Liu Ju, Wudi's original heir. Bingyi was the only member of Ju's family who had been spared death after the Crown Prince revolt and the witch trials. He had been raised a commoner, but at some point had been enregistered as a member of the imperial clan again. He was known as the imperial great-grandson. Huoguang again passed over Liu Su and chose Liu He, the next in line. Like he had done when Liu Fuying had been chosen to succeed Wu Di, Huo used precedent from the classical texts to justify his choice to his opponents, who thought that Liu Su, the sole living son of Wu Di, should succeed. Huo used the story of Tai Bo, which had been briefly mentioned by Confucius in the Analects, and the story of Bo Yikao, which was mentioned in the Book of Rites, in which an older descendant of a ruler was passed over in favour of a younger. He told the other officials, quote, King Tai of Zhou abandoned Tai Bo and enthroned Wang Ji. King Wen put aside Bo Yikao and enthroned King Wu. It depends on who is appropriate, and therefore it is permissible to abandon the elder in the favour of the younger. The king of Guangling, Liu Su, cannot offer sacrifices in the shrine of the imperial family. Liu He was 18 or 19, and was eagerly anticipating the announcement, fully expecting to be chosen. When he saw the fire beacons confirming his hopes, he made for the capital as soon as possible, leaving the same afternoon. He travelled as fast as he could, while allowing time to party all along the way, ordering his servants to bring him meat and women. Such enthusiasm was highly improper. After all, the empire was in mourning for Xuandi, and there were explicit prohibitions on sexual intercourse and the eating of meat while the mourning period lasted. Even after Liu He arrived in the capital, he continued his wanton behaviour. He was coronated on the 18th of July, 74 BC. At the same time, Empress Shangguan, Xiaodi's wife and the granddaughter of Huoguang, was named Empress Dowager. This resulted in an unusual situation, where Shangguan, though a teenage girl younger than Liu He, was technically his adoptive mother. Part of the coronation ceremony was for the new emperor to pay his respects in the temple of Gaozu. However, Liu He decided to put this off in favour of pleasure-seeking. He feasted, played music, lavished his followers with grand rewards, and slept around, all while the capital was meant to be in a mood of solemnity for Xuandi, who wasn't even buried yet. Huoguang worried that the new emperor was unsuitable for the job. He convened with his followers, looking to see if anything could be done about the situation. They reminded him of a precedent from antiquity, which could justify a minister deposing an emperor. It concerned the minister Yi Yin, aide of Tang, the founder of the Shang dynasty, and how he intervened in the rule of Tai Jia, Tang's grandson. The story was contained in the 4th century BC Confucian text Mencius, where it was said to have been approved of by Confucius himself. Quote, Yi Yin assisted Tang so that he could become sovereign over the kingdom. After the demise of Tang, Tai Ding, having died before he could be appointed sovereign, Wai Bing reigned 2 years, and Zhongsan 4. Tai Jia was then turning upside down the statutes of Tang, where Yi Yin placed him in Tong, Tang's tomb, for 3 years. There Tai Jia repented of his errors, was contrite, and reformed himself. In Tong, he came to dwell in benevolence and walk in righteousness, during those 3 years, listening to the lessons given to him by Yi Yin. Then Yi Yin again returned with him to Bo. With this story making a moral argument for what he wanted to do, Huoguang decided to act. Unlike Yi Yin though, he did not hold any illusions that he would be able to reform Liu He. Huo utilized his influence over the Empress Dowager, his granddaughter Shangguan, to engineer the deposition. Usually for a proposal to be passed into law, it was necessary for a senior minister or two to sign it and for the emperor to give his approval. For this special circumstance, Huo got every minister to put their name down for Liu He's removal, and turned to Empress Dowager Xuandi for imperial approval. The plan was carried out on the 14th of August, just 27 days after Liu He had been coronated. He was invited to the Empress Dowager's quarters, where he was greeted with the Empress in full regalia, Huoguang, and hundreds of armed attendants. His own followers were barred from entering and were arrested, while he was forced to prostrate himself and listen to the charges made against him. The memorial concluded by saying that as Liu He had still failed to go to the Temple of Gaozu and complete the coronation ceremony, he had shown himself to be unfilial and incapable of carrying on the imperial line. After Empress Dowager Xuandi gave her assent, Huoguang asked Liu He to bow and acknowledge the edict. When He refused, Huo forcibly took the imperial seals off him and gave them to the empress. He was sent back to Changyi and demoted to the status of a commoner. However, several years later, in 63, he was forgiven and even made Marquis of Haihun. If we consider all the monarchs in history for whom losing their position meant losing their lives, then Liu He was pretty fortunate. Huoguang's deposition of Liu He is usually considered a righteous act by a loyal minister to ensure that China and the Han dynasty would not be imperiled by an unworthy emperor. Homer H. Dubs, translator of the Book of Han, says that its success, quote, depended upon the loyalty of the minister who made the change and his reputation in the court. And for myself, I do think that the deposal was in accordance with the public interest. However, I think it's worth noting that Huo had some personal interest at stake too. In Xuandi's reign, Huo had enjoyed a friendly relationship with the emperor, and after the Shangguan conspiracy of 80 BC, he was unchallenged as the most influential man in China. When Liu He arrived in Chang'an though, his behaviour not only showed him to be an unworthy emperor, but it also probably indicated that he was not the sort of person who would listen to Huoguang. There was also a more immediate political challenge that Liu He presented. During Xuandi's reign, Huo had been able to select his own friends and allies to fill the important positions of government. However, once Liu He arrived in Chang'an, it seems he wanted to promote men who had served him while he was king of Changyi, men whom Huoguang held no sway over. Liu He received warnings from both Huo's allies and his own men not to cast aside Huo's people so lightly, and after he was deposed, nearly every one of his men who had come from Changyi to Chang'an was executed, about 200 people in all. Even if Huo was mainly concerned with his own position in his deposition of Liu he was smart enough to know that he needed to put another Liu on the throne, rather than make any attempt to completely usurp the imperial line. He turned to the imperial great-grandson, Liu Bingyi. He was enthroned on the 14th of September, 74 BC, and is known to history as Xiao Xuan Huangdi, filial and well-known August Emperor, Xuandi for short. Unusually, Bangu gives us a fairly detailed description of Xuandi's life before he became emperor. Because Xuandi was parentless, and had spent his very early years as a commoner, his formative years had been atypical for a member of the Liu clan. Even after being brought back to the palace and being reinstated into the imperial clan, he seems to have wandered fairly freely and took an interest in life outside the imperial bubble. He came into contact with the lower levels of government that ordinary people interacted with in their everyday lives. There were several men who had a role in raising the young Xuandi, but the most important was a eunuch named Zhang He. Zhang had been an ally of Xuandi's grandfather, Liu Ju, and had been castrated as punishment following the Crown Prince revolt. He was in charge for the section of the palace where Xuandi grew up, and provided him with resources for education, and eventually arranged a marriage for him to a daughter of one of his subordinates. Her name was Su Pingjun. This passage from the Book of Han gives us a bit of insight into Xuandi's pre-emperor lifestyle and his character. Quote, he studied the Book of Odes with Fu Zhongweng of Donghai Commandery. He showed great ability and loved studying. He also delighted in roving braces, in cockfighting, and in horse racing. He was acquainted with all the undesirable elements of the hamlets and villages, and with the accomplishments and defects in the government of the minor officials. He several times participated in the ascending and descending of the various imperial tombs, an annual sacrifice for deceased emperors, going all about the 3 capital commanderies. He was once in trouble at the salt beds of Lianshao. He especially enjoyed himself in the region of Du and Hu, and he was very commonly at Xiadu. At the times when the spring and autumn courts were held, he dwelt in Shangguan ward of Chang'an. On his whole body, and even on the bottoms of his feet, there was hair. Where he slept and dwelt, there were frequently lights and shinings. Whenever he bought cakes, each time the shop from which he bought made great sales. Because of these things, even he marvelled at himself. The things described in the later section of the passage are a similar sort of supernatural portents to the sorts of phenomena that accompany the story of Gaozu, who was also said to have been very hairy. Though it's not clear how they became part of the narrative, they serve a similar sort of purpose, to reassure us that despite the unusual circumstances of his secession, Xuandi had divine powers on his side that approved of his becoming emperor. Now, there are some parts of Liu Bingyi's backstory that suggest that Huo Guang was indirectly involved in Bingyi's boyhood. Zhang He, Liu Bingyi's key patron, was a brother of Zhang Anshi, one of Huo Guang's allies. There was also an incident from when Liu Bingyi was still an infant, in jail following the execution of his family. Emperor Wu was in one of his fits of paranoid delusion, and ordered that the child be killed, apparently because of some divine emanations which indicated the presence of a son of heaven in the jail. But the man who was sent to get Bingyi was prevented from doing so by Bingji, the prison governor, and an ally of Huo Guang. Bingji had been looking after the infant Bingyi, and protected him until Wu Di regained his sanity. There's also the question of when exactly Bingyi was reinstated as a member of the imperial clan, and who exactly was behind the reinstatement, because there are various confused accounts from different chapters of the Book of Han. It's possible that the decision was made at a time when Huo Guang had his hands on the steering wheel, either when Wu Di was on his deathbed or during the reign of Xiaodi. If Huo Guang was the one who brought Bingyi back into the imperial family, and if the presence of some of Huo Guang's associates in Bingyi's early years was deliberate, then it suggests that Huo Guang might have been playing a long-term game to ensure that if Liu Bingyi eventually became emperor, he would be on friendly terms with the Huos. And indeed, when Xuandi came to the throne at around 18 years of age, he was happy to let Huo Guang continue to steer the government. Huo apparently offered to resign after Xuandi was appointed, but Xuandi insisted that Huo was indispensable. Xuandi was very grateful to Huo and the ministers who had brought him to the throne, and fiefing several of them and increasing Huo Guang's marquisate by 17,000 households. Huo's family members were in good positions, holding important posts in court or commanding units of the imperial guard. It looked like Xuandi would be the sort of emperor who was happy for the Huo clan to continue enjoying their prominent position. However, there was one small incident early on where Xuandi and the Huos came into dispute. An important matter whenever a new emperor was appointed was the question of his empress. Huo Guang had a daughter, Huo Changjun, whom he wanted to take the position, and gave her to Xuandi to join his harem. But Xuandi was loyal to his first wife, Su Pingjun, whom he had married before becoming emperor. She was made empress in the winter of 74-3. Huo Guang objected to the appointment, but he ended up letting it go. However, his wife, Huo Xian, was determined to have her daughter become empress. On her own initiative, she determined to do something about Empress Su. The opportunity came a few years later, when Empress Su became pregnant and fell sick. One of the palace's women doctors, Shunyu Yan, was friendly with the Huos, and happened to ask them for a favour. Huo Xian exploited this chance, telling Shunyu that they could grant her request if she poisoned Empress Su. When she was able to do so, Shunyu mixed the extract of some poisonous shells with the medicine intended for Su. The mixture was effective, and the Empress died a very painful death in the spring of 71. But in her final, terrible moments, she managed to gasp out that she had been poisoned. All of the doctors who had attended on her were arrested and questioned. Huo Xian couldn't reward Shunyu without rousing suspicion over the doctor or herself. She secretly confessed to Huo Guang what she had done. Huo Guang was silent, neither praising his wife nor condemning her. He managed to get Shunyu freed, and concealed his wife's role in the murder. But I suspect that if he had had the chance, he would have stopped the murder from happening. I don't think he was so intent on elevating his family that he would have resorted to such violent means. And even if he was, killing the Empress was a very risky move. Indeed, it ended up being a terrible mistake for the Huos. For now though, Xuandi did in fact accomplish her objective. The next year, in the spring of 70 BC, Huo Changjun was appointed empress. Though suspicion remained over the death of Empress Su, the matter was not investigated much further. For the next couple of years, things went on without much political intrigue. Xuandi continued to leave governing to Huo Guang, and the Huos continued to enjoy their prominence. Huo was able to effectively decide who should serve in government. He chose 2 new chancellors in Xuandi's reign. The first, Cai Yi, was a scholar of the Book of Odes. He was in his 80s when he attained the position in 74, and so frail that he needed 2 men to help him walk. Huo had given him a series of rapid promotions during Xuandi's reign, making him superintendent of the Lesser Treasury in 78 BC, and imperial councillor in 75. The man who replaced Cai as chancellor was Wei Xian, who was a similar sort of character. A court academician with expertise in the Odes, he was made superintendent of state visits in 76 BC, when he was in his late 60s, and then became chancellor in 71. The appointment of these 2 elderly Confucian scholars to the chancellorship served a double purpose for Huo. On one hand, it helped him keep the official bureaucracy feeble and left Huo free to conduct affairs how he liked. Neither Cai Yi or Wei Xian were dynamic or competent officials, not at all likely to intrude on Huo's administration. It was said of Wei Xian in particular that despite spending 5 years as chancellor, he did not learn any skills of governance. But their appointment was also a sort of PR move for Huo. Opponents had been accusing Huo of only appointing his friends and allies to government positions. Selecting these 2 elderly Confucian scholars to be chancellor was a way for him to deflect these criticisms. Since the Warring States era, Confucians had been selling themselves and their philosophy as the best answer to the questions of governance, and despite outcomes not always matching up with their confidence, and criticism from their opponents, this image lingered on. Furthermore, since the days of Wu Di, when the core erudites had been limited to studying Confucian classics and the Imperial Academy had been established, the language of classicism had become more and more entwined with government. Huo Guang himself had played a major part in this injection of Confucianism into politics, with his frequent use of classical anecdotes to justify his regency and political decisions, which may otherwise have come off as blatant usurpation. Just from what I've mentioned, we saw him allude to historical episodes contained in various classics at the controversial accession of Xuandi. He used classical episodes again to justify appointing Liu He to succeed Xuandi, and then again to depose Liu He. Huo had relied on classical anecdotes for more major decisions and to a greater extent than perhaps any previous Han politician, and this really helped foment the idea that the skills of a classicist were useful in government. Given this environment, the appointment of Cai Yi and Wei Xian, 2 elderly Confucian scholars who were not close associates of Huo Guang, was a way for Huo to signal that he had nothing but the best intentions for the empire. Chancellors weren't the only ones getting on in years. By now, Huo Guang himself was in the winter phase of his life. In the spring of 68, he passed away. Xuandi honoured him with a funeral that was second only to that of an emperor. He was given an immense burial hill, and his body clothed in a jade suit, an ornament that was usually reserved for members of the imperial family. After the death, Xuandi issued a eulogy for Huo. It reads, quote, "The Commander-in-Chief and General-in-Chief, the Marquis of Beaulieu, was constantly on guard for Empress Xiao Wu for more than 30 years, and acted as assistant to Empress Xiao Zhao for more than 10 years. He met with the greatest difficulties, but he himself held firmly to his fealty. He led the 3 highest ministers, the nobles, the 9 high ministers, and the grandees, in determining upon the plan for enthroning us, the emperor, which is to determine the imperial succession for 10,000 generations, and thereby gave peace to the imperial ancestral temples. The multitude of common people in the empire have all as a result enjoyed tranquility and peace. His merits and virtues were abundant and great, so that we have esteemed him most highly." He went on to grant Huo's descendants an estate which they could hold in perpetuity, and an exemption from all taxes and obligations, which would be passed from generation to generation. And he ranked Huo himself as the equal of Xiao He, the man who had been Gaodi's chancellor and the most highly esteemed minister in the history of the Han dynasty. Despite the lavishing of Huoguang and his family, with their chief patriarch gone, their future was questionable. It was always a cause for concern when a single family became very powerful, so the Huos had many enemies. Moreover, Xuandi correctly suspected that the Huos were behind the death of his first wife, Empress Su, and could not let that go unpunished. Thus, Xuandi started making moves to diminish the influence of the Huos. Huoguang and his family had been able to use their power over the Secretariat to influence policy, since the Secretariat determined which proposals were brought before the Emperor. Huoguang had been the director of the Secretariat after the death of Wu Di, and after his death, the job had passed on to his grandnephew, Huo Shan. Whenever an item was proposed to the Emperor, it was meant to come with a duplicate or an abstract so that the director of the Secretariat could read it and decide whether to bring it to the Emperor's attention. But after Huoguang's death, Xuandi asked that people submit proposals as just a single copy, sealed, so that he himself would be the first to open it. He started to attend the court in person, and in general take a more active role in government. This change in secretarial procedure was suggested by the imperial councillor, Wei Xiang. Wei was an experienced minister, and he seems to have played a key role in turning Xuandi against the Huos. Shortly after Huoguang's death, Wei sent a memorial to Xuandi through Su Guanghan, the late Empress Su's father. He couldn't use the usual channel of the Secretariat because Huo Shan would have prevented the letter from reaching the Emperor. It read, quote, "In its protests against the statesmen of the day, the Spring and Autumn Annals expresses regret that in the state of Song, men of the same family were appointed councillors for 3 successive generations, and that full powers of government were monopolised by the Ji Sun family in Lu, for these were both states which fell into danger and ruin. Ever since the Huo Yan period, when Wu Di died, the gift of office has been taken away from the imperial houses, and the power of government has been exercised by the chief minister. And now that Huoguang is dead, his son has in turn been appointed supreme general. His nephew grasps in his hands the instruments for governing the state, and his close relatives occupy substantially important positions in the armed forces. Huoguang's widow, Huo Xian, and his daughters possess authority to come and go as they please in the Changxin Palace. They issue their orders when they like, as often as not by night, and their extravagances and indulgences are beyond control. It is only right that their personal powers should be curtailed, and that the schemes which they are harbouring should be brought to nothing, so as to provide generations to come with a strong basis of security, and to preserve intact for the future the achievements of those who have rendered service to the state." From then on, Wei often had private talks with Xuandi, where he warned the Emperor of the danger that the Huos presented if they monopolised all the positions of government. At some point, Xuandi and Wei Xiang found evidence that Huo Xian had been behind the murder of Empress Su, but for the moment, they didn't make any noise about it. They wanted to steadily diminish the Huos' power, but to do so without provoking them too much. After all, several Huos were in command of military units in the capital, and if they got too jumpy, they might do something drastic. Thus, Xuandi and Wei avoided making any open accusations against the Huos. Wei Xiang recommended to Xuandi that he promote Zhang Shi, the brother of Xuandi's old patron Zhang He, in order to draw power away from the Huos. Although Zhang had been friendly with Huoguang, I guess he was considered an appropriate alternative. In the summer of 67, Zhang Shi was made Marshal of State, the title Huoguang had held, and he was made director of the Secretariat, replacing Huo Shan, and hijacking the institution that had been so vital to the Huo's control of government. He was also given command of some of the army garrisons at the capital. 2 months after Zhang Shi's promotions, Wei Xiang himself was made chancellor. The appointment of this dynamic, capable statesman to the position was a departure from the feeble, old scholar types of Huoguang's era. It was probably intended to push the locus of government from the Secretariat back to the official ministers. Shortly afterwards, in the autumn, Zhang Shi was given a more important command than the garrisons, that of the palace guards. Then, in the winter, they started downgrading some of the Huos. This started with Huo Yu, the son of Huoguang, and probably the most senior male member of the family, and was done in a particularly clever way. After the death of Huoguang, Huo Yu had been made general of the right, and commanded some garrisons in the city. He was now given the title Marshal of State, which ordinarily would have been a great honour. However, he was not given the seals which would allow him to exercise any authority, and the garrisons he had commanded were disestablished in the name of cost-saving. Moreover, because Zhang Anshi simultaneously held the title Marshal of State, the prestige that name had carried in the time of Huo Guang was diminished. Thus, while Huo Yu was being exalted, his actual power was being taken away. Other Huos were slowly moved from important positions in the capital to jobs in distant commanderies. Simply by some strategic appointments and procedural changes, Wei Xiang and Xuandi had revitalized the office of Chancellor and lessened the importance of the Secretariat and the title Marshal of State, the two institutions which had been most integral to the Huo's political power. While all this was going on, there was another side of the chessboard where the Huos had some potentially powerful pieces, that being the two empresses, Empress Dowager Shangguan, Xuandi's adoptive mother, and Empress Huo, his wife. However, Xuandi was immutable to any influence these women might have held over him. He instead remained devoted to his former wife, the late Empress Su. In the summer of 67, he nominated his son by Su, Liu Shi, as his heir apparent. He also enfeoffed Su's father, Su Guanghan, as a marquis. The nomination of Liu Shi infuriated Huo Xian. An empress's power was at its greatest when her husband died and she was the mother of the ruling emperor. And if that ruling emperor was going to be Liu Shi, then Huo Xian's daughter, Empress Huo, had been deprived of that position. Again, Huo Xian saw murder as the solution to her predicament, and tried to poison Liu Shi. But since the death of Empress Su, food and medicine security in the palace had been stepped up, so her attempts were unsuccessful. But again, the plot wasn't immediately discovered. Now remember, these attempts by Huo Xian to poison Empress Su and now Liu Shi were carried out on her own volition, and in fact many of the senior members of the Huo clan were unaware of them. But as the Huos were despairing about Xuandi's coolness towards them since the death of Huo Guang, Huo Xian decided to reveal what she had done to the rest of her family. It was terrible news for the Huos. They assumed that punishment for these deeds was inevitable. In desperation, they formulated a plot to usurp the imperial family. They intended to utilize the authority of the Empress Dowager Shangguan, as Huo Guang had successfully done in the deposition of Liu He. They planned to invite Wei Xiang, the Chancellor, and Su Guanghan, the father of the late Empress Su, to a dinner, during which they would assassinate these two opponents of their family, and have the Empress Dowager authorize an edict to dethrone Xuandi and make Huo Yu the emperor. But before they could even begin to enact their plot, one of their messengers was caught and revealed the whole thing to the government. Xuandi was quick to act. He increased the number of guards at the palace of Empress Dowager Shangguan, isolating her from the rest of the Huos and preventing her from learning of the plot. Then, in the autumn of 66, he made an edict announcing the discovery of the plot and arrested the members of the Huo family and their allies. Huo Yu and Huo Xian were executed. Huo Shan, the former director of the Secretariat, and another of Huo Guang's grandnephews, Huo Yun, committed suicide. Men such as the generals Fan Mingyo, Ren Sheng, Zhao Ping, and a palace treasurer, Deng Guanghan, who were married to Huo women and involved in the plot, were also killed. Xuandi's wife, Empress Huo, was dismissed a month later and sent to live in the Shanglin Park. 11 years later, when she was moved even further from the capital, she committed suicide. The only one to come away unscathed was Empress Dowager Shangguan. She was still young, just 25, and probably a mere pawn of the Huo's plan. It seems she never even learned of the conspiracy before Xuandi revealed it. She kept her position and died a natural death in the reign of the next emperor. Interestingly, Xuandi also granted an amnesty to anyone who had been involved in the plot but had not been discovered yet. Huo Guang had been a master of using Confucian rhetoric to support his big political decisions. The emperor was now able to use the same sort of language to justify the elimination of the remaining Huos. During the process of removing the Huos from power, several classical scholars presented memorials to the emperor that agreed with the ongoing deposition. They used familiar techniques, such as citing historical episodes from the classics, as well as employing cosmological arguments of the sort that Dong Zhongshu had brought to the fore in Wudi's reign. With this sort of support behind him, Xuandi was able to present his removal of the family that had been instrumental to putting him on the throne in the first place as a good deed, and avoid charges that it was a sign of ingratitude or some other deficiency of virtue. In terms of internal politics, the fall of the Hors was probably the most important singular event of Xuandi's reign. But in foreign politics, there was an even more monumental happening. In 51 BC, the Chinese achieved what probably was, to their minds, their greatest victory over the Xiongnu. This was the surrender of a Shan Yu, who acknowledged himself a subject of the emperor. However, the immediate cause for this surrender was not military effort on the Chinese part, but the disintegration of the Xiongnu Confederacy. With one notable exception, there was no significant fighting between the Chinese and the Xiongnu in Xuandi's reign. Indeed, the fact that the surrender happened without military effort probably made it look like an even greater achievement to the Chinese. Before we get into the surrender though, I'll go over that notable exception, the one instance of major fighting between the Chinese and the Xiongnu. This was the campaign to help the Wu Sun, a nomadic people of the western regions, to attack the Xiongnu. It occurred early in Xuandi's reign, while Huoguang was still alive. The leader of the Wu Sun was married to a Han princess, and in the winter of 72-1, he asked China for assistance in attacking the Xiongnu. The Chinese raised an army of 150,000 horsemen, headed by 5 generals, to help. As well as the Chinese and the Wu Sun forces, there were soldiers from other nomadic peoples, including the Dingling and the Wu Huan. They inflicted some major defeats on the Xiongnu. This victory, together with the Chinese conquest of Jushi, a Xiongnu ally, in 67 BC, closed the door on Xiongnu influence in the western regions. But the surrender was really a product of a succession crisis within the Xiongnu ranks. The Confederacy had become very fractal as it grew in power. It had always been less centralised than the Han, and the size of the Confederacy had really stretched things beyond what it was designed for. Originally, Xiongnu leaders had been organised into a dualistic hierarchy, with the 2 most important leaders under the Shan Yu being called the wise kings of the left and right, with similar divisions down the chain of command. But as more tribes had been assimilated into the Confederacy, there were introduced new kings, such as the Hunye and the Xiuqiu, which did not have a place in the left-right organising principle. There were cases where Xiongnu chiefs refused to attend the Shan Yu's court. We can induce that the power of the local leaders began to rival the authority of the Shan Yu, rather than support it. Moreover, the prestige of the Shan Yu within the Confederacy had deteriorated over the years. At the beginning, there had been Shan Yus such as Mao Dun and the third Shan Yu, Jun Chen, who had reigned for several decades, and had plenty of time to cultivate their gravitas by conquering neighbouring tribes and raiding the Chinese. But later Shan Yus didn't enjoy such long reigns, which, along with the changing geopolitical situation, denied them the opportunities to accrue such reputations. Between 114 and 60 BC, there were 7 Shan Yus. In the same period, China had seen just 3 emperors, 4 if you count Liu He. The Xiongnu also had a fairly strict principle of passing the throne down from father to son, which, on a few occasions, landed them with a leader who was too young to be effective, and as I speculated last episode, the Xiongnu system didn't have the sort of institutions which could control for such a situation. Furthermore, it had become harder to attack China, for they were losing their grip on the western regions. Historian Mark Edward Lewis even suggests that when the Chinese slowed down their attacks on the Xiongnu, this could have had a negative impact on the Shan Yu's legitimacy, for he could no longer claim to be defending the tribal people from Chinese encroachment. So, in 60 BC, a new Shan Yu succeeded to the throne, known as Wu Yanzhuti. Wu Yanzhuti had formerly been the Wise King of the Right, the head of the western portion of the Confederacy. When he came to power, he conducted a purge of the members of the court who were from the eastern portion. Perhaps because of this instability, in the autumn, one of the Xiongnu's subordinate kings defected to the Chinese, bringing with him more than 10,000 men. Wu Yanzhuti also made an effort to keep the Chinese happy. Later the same year, he sent another subordinate king to pay his respects to the emperor, and in 58 BC, he sent his younger brother, the king of Huliu Ruo. That same year, 58, the persecuted faction of the Xiongnu held up a man as a rival claimant to the throne. He was known as Shan Yu Hu Hanye. He did battle with Wu Yanzhuti and defeated him, but that was far from the end of things. The Confederacy splintered into different parts, and soon there were 5 different men, including Hu Hanye, who were fighting over the title of Shan Yu. A Chinese edict from 55 describes the frightful situation. Quote, various Xiongnu kings simultaneously set themselves up and divided the Xiongnu realm between 5 Shan Yu. In turn they attacked and fought with each other. The dead numbered in the 10,000s. The Xiongnu flocks and herds have been largely destroyed, even to the extent of 8 or 9 tents, and their people are hungry and starving, so that they roast and broil each other in seeking for food. In 56 BC, one of these rival Shan Yus, Hu Su Lei, dropped out of the civil war and defected to the Han. By 54, there were just 2 left, Hu Hanye and his brother, Zhiji. Zhiji defeated Hu Hanye in battle, who then took his followers south to see if they could find some peaceful living arrangement closer to China. Hu Hanye sent another of his brothers, the Lu Li King, to Chang'an. The Lu Li King acted in a diplomatic role, joining the imperial court. Hu Hanye and his followers knew that they were at a turning point. They understood that for the Chinese to agree to peace, they would have to acknowledge themselves a vassal state of the emperor. A faction of his nobles argued against seeking peace. They said that it would be a humiliation, that other peoples would lose all respect for Hu Hanye's Xiongnu. They would lose everything they had won over the past century and a half. But others realized that whether or not the Xiongnu accepted Han peace, the days of the Xiongnu, or at least of Hu Hanye's Xiongnu, being a great power, were over. The Yiqizi king of the left argued, quote, Han's power is now at its peak. Wu Sun and other walled states have all become China's vassals. By contrast, we Xiongnu have been declining in power since the days of the Shan Yu Judiho, who reigned from 101 to 97 BC. And there is no way for us to restore our fallen fortunes. In spite of all our exertions, we have experienced scarcely a single day of tranquility. At present, our very security depends on whether we submit to the Han or not. What better course is there for us to follow? Hu Hanye was convinced by those advocating for peace and submission to the Han. In the spring of 53 BC, he sent his son, the Wise King of the Right, to Chang'an to join the court of the emperor and act as a diplomatic hostage, as was the standard practice for foreign vassals. In the winter of that year, Shan Yu Zhiji, who was still ruling his own faction of Xiongnu further north, sent his younger brother, the Wise King of the Left, to Chang'an to pay respect to the emperor. He was perhaps realizing that having a good relationship with China would be a handy card to hold in the ongoing Xiongnu civil war. In the winter of 52-1, Shan Yu Hu Hanye came to the border gates of Wu Yuan Commandery in the center of the northern border. He presented a formal statement, saying that he would like to come to Chang'an in person and participate in the New Year's tribute ceremony, wherein the emperor received homage from all his vassals. The Chinese were delighted by the news. This was what they had been hoping for since the victories of Wu Di. But now they had their own choice to make. Should Shan Yu Hu Hanye be welcomed as a subject or as a guest? When it came to meeting the emperor, there was different protocol for people of different stations. In the annual court for receiving homage, vassals are ranked according to their proximity to the capital, in keeping with the worldview that placed people in different zones of civilization. Chinese vassals, the kings from the Liu clan, were ranked above barbarian vassals, like the kings of China's allies in the western regions. Treating the Shan Yu as a subject would mean ranking him behind the barbarian kings, and emphasizing China's victory over the Xiongnu. and there was a faction who wanted Xuandi to receive Hu Hanye as a subject. The High Ministers presented a memorial to the Emperor, which read, quote, "According to the institutes of the Sage Kings, in granting favours and in treating people in accordance with the rules of proper conduct, the Emperor should put the capital region ahead and put the rest of the Chinese states behind. He should then put the Chinese states ahead and put the barbarians behind. The Book of Odes says, Xie led his people in accordance with the rules of proper conduct, so they did not transgress those rules. Everyone paid attention to his orders and acted accordingly. As a consequence, Xiang too was majestic, and even states beyond the seas were well ordered. Your Majesty's sage virtue has completely filled heaven and earth, and your brilliance has extended to the four extremities of the empire, so that the Xiongnu Shanyu has turned towards your good example, longs to perform his duties of fealty, and his whole country is agreed that he should present treasures and pay your Majesty court to present his congratulations. Such a thing has not happened from ancient times to the present. A Shanyu is not a ruler to whom the first day of the month in the Chinese calendar is applicable, or who can be treated as a guest by a true universal king. This line seems to mean that it's inappropriate for the Shanyu to use that title, if he is to be a subject of the emperor. The literal meaning of Shanyu was equivalent to the Son of Heaven. According to the rites and ceremonies, it is proper that he should acknowledge himself a subject like the vassal kings, employ the standard phrase used by subjects in their memorials, risking death and making repeated obeisances, and be ranked next below the vassal kings. I mentioned earlier that the fact that Hu Hanye's surrender was not the immediate product of a Chinese military victory probably made the event seem even greater to the Chinese. The line in this memorial about how it was the emperor's virtue which attracted the Shanyu to pay homage is my reason for thinking this. If this surrender had been the result of a recent Chinese campaign, then the theory that it was the emperor's virtue which had induced the Xiongnu to submit would be a bit harder to agree with. Of course, the very idea of attracting barbarians by manifesting virtue is something we've talked about several times, and was often tied to Confucian thinking. And indeed, the memorial makes at least two references to classical texts, with the quote from the Book of Odes, as well as the line, "Your brilliance is extended to the four extremities of the empire," being a reference to the Book of Documents. So it seems most of the members of court wanted Xuandi to treat Hu Hanye as an inferior subject. However, there was a competing idea that he should be treated as a guest, and this was the course of action that Xuandi decided on. It didn't exactly mean treating Hu Hanye as an equal, but it was more respectful. Hu Hanye was honoured above all the other Chinese vassals, including the Chinese kings. There were probably two main reasons for choosing this option. Firstly, the Han had generally followed a policy of treating defecting Xiongnu respectfully and honourably, hoping that it would encourage further defections. And while Hu Hanye had acknowledged China's sovereignty, there were still Ziji's Xiongnu and other barbarian peoples out there who were yet to do so. Secondly, it's possible that the Han were overawed by the surrender. After all, the Xiongnu had been the Han's greatest enemy since the beginning of the dynasty, and the title Shan Yu had once been held by men who were considered almost equals of the emperor. Now, a Shan Yu was voluntarily offering to pay obeisance. Perhaps to treat Hu Hanye as any other barbarian vassal would, in a way, undercut the enormity of the event. In his edict announcing the decision, Xuandi said, quote, "Verily, we have heard that the 5 lords and the 3 dynasties of kings did not touch in their administration those who had not been influenced by the rules of proper conduct, that is, the most remote barbarians. Now the Xiongnu Shan Yu has styled himself our feudatory at the northern frontier, and is coming to pay court in the first month. We are inadequate, and our virtue is unable to cover the earth widely. Let the Shan Yu be treated according to the rights for a guest, and let his rank be above that of the vassal kings." The Book of Han also contains a passage describing the actual meeting of Shan Yu Hu Hanye and Emperor Xuan, which happened in the first month of the 3rd year of the era Ganlu, spring 51 BC. Quote, "When the Xiongnu Shan Yu Hu Hanye, Luandi Jihor Shan, came to pay court, he was introduced and announced as a subject from the border, but his personal name was not used, and he was granted an imperial seal and seal ribbon, hats, girdles, garments, a comfortable carriage, a quadriga of horses, actual gold, silk, flowered silk, embroidery, and silk floss. The emperor had high officials lead the Shan Yu. First he went to his prince's lodge in Chang'an and spent the night at Changping Lodge. The emperor, coming from Ganchuan Palace, spent the night at Qiyang Palace. When the emperor mounted the Changping slope, he instructed the Shan Yu by an edict not to pay his respects then, and so the multitude of his eastern and western Dang Hu all spread themselves out to observe the imperial cortege. The barbarian baronets, chiefs, kings, and marquises, and those who met the cortege, numbering several 10,000s of people, crowded the road and arranged themselves in order. When the emperor mounted the Wei River Bridge, with one accord they cried out, "Long life!" The Shan Yu went to his prince's lodge. The emperor held a feast in the Jianzhang Palace and granted the Shan Yu a great banquet, at which the Shan Yu was shown the imperial treasures. During the ceremony, Hu Hanye was excused from performing the usual prostrations before the emperor, and the bit about not using his personal name was a point of respect. Usually, the emperor addressed his vassals by using their personal names, but he addressed Hu Hanye using the official title Shan Yu Hu Hanye, rather than his personal name, Luandi Jihor Shan. The next month, Hu Hanye and his men were escorted back to the border, and they took up residence just outside of China, south of the Gobi. If Hu Hanye felt at all ashamed to pay homage to the emperor, this was completely offset by the personal gifts he received while he was staying in Chang'an. He was granted 5 kilograms of gold, 200,000 cash, 77 sets of clothes, 8,000 bales of silk fabric, 1,500 kilograms of silk floss, and 15 horses. Then, when he returned to the border, he was promised continuing food relief from the border commanderies for his people. The first installment amounted to 680,000 litres of grain. Hu Hanye was so pleased with these gifts that he asked if he could come to Chang'an again for the tribute ceremony in 49 BC. On that occasion, he was even more richly rewarded, being granted 110 sets of clothing, 9,000 bales of silk fabric, and 2,000 kilograms of silk floss. But after this, he was kept from paying homage again for several years, because of the ongoing war with his brother, the rival Shan Yu Zhiji. Xuandi died in 49 BC, so our discussion of the Xiongnu for this episode ends here, with the Confederacy, in decline since the days of Wu Di, now divided under 2 Shan Yus, one of whom was paying obeisance to the emperor as a vassal. Aside from the matters regarding the Xiongnu, there's one other important foreign policy thing to mention, which was a conscious change of strategy when it came to dealing with the western regions. Rather than sending Chinese armies there whenever trouble was afoot, the Han decided to plant agricultural garrisons in the region. These were like self-sustaining military colonies, which could quickly respond to emergencies in the area. The proposal was brought to the government by a general, Zhao Chongguo, in 61 BC, following a revolt by the Qiang that same year, although the idea had been floating around for a while. Sang Hongyang, that minister who had developed the Sultan iron monopolies, had been a strong advocate for agricultural garrisons in Wu Di's reign, and indeed a limited number had been established then. The change in strategy was stamped by the establishment of the Office of the Protector General of the Western Regions in 60 BC. The office was headquartered in the city Wulei, also known as Chador, more than 700 kilometers west of the Chinese border. It was created after the surrender of the Xiongnu Riju king that same year. The Xiongnu had conducted their relationships with the western regions through the office of a minister called the Commandant in Charge of Slaves, who had been a subordinate of the Riju king. When the Riju king surrendered, that office was abolished, and the way was opened for the Chinese to establish an office of their own. In fact, it's possible that the Chinese simply took over the headquarters of the Commandant in Charge of Slaves and used it for the Protector General of the western regions. The first Protector General was Zheng Ji, who had been the officer to receive the Riju king's surrender. Under Zheng Ji, a colony was created in the territory of the state of Jushi, also known as Turfan, and a pre-existing colony at Zhuli, also known as Kurla, was expanded to 1,500 soldiers. The main tasks of the Protector General were coordinating the new agricultural colonies and maintaining peaceful relationships with the states of the western regions. It was not designed as a headquarters for launching further conquest campaigns, and was an important part of the switch from expansion to retrenchment. The fall of the Huors and the submission of Huhenye are the two most narrative-friendly happenings of Xuandi's reign. But we also need to talk about Xuandi's style of government, which is actually one of the more interesting topics. The period is usually seen as a continuation of the transition to reformist policies that roughly began with Xuandi. We saw it in the foreign policy, with the establishment of the Colonel Protector of the Western regions, marking a turn away from aggression to defensiveness. Economic policy continued the philosophy of lightening the people's burdens, with similar instruments that had been used in Xuandi's reign. There were government loans and temporary tax cuts used as relief for natural disasters. There was one notable permanent tax cut in 52 BC, when the denomination of currency known as the Xuan was reduced in value from 120 cash to 90 cash. This had the effect of diminishing taxes that were measured in Xuan, the main one being the poll tax. Men and women between 15 and 56 were liable for 1 Xuan a year. I assume the effect also carried through for other taxes measured in Xuan, such as the special poll tax on merchants, and several of the property taxes. Another interesting move was the reduction of the price of salt in 66 BC, following some bad floods. Such a move was possible because of the government monopoly on salt. Thus, a modernist tool, the salt monopoly, could be used to achieve an end that would have pleased reformists, easing the lives of the common people. And this leads us to one of the interesting themes of Xuandi's reign. For despite the trend of the era being towards reformism, there is some evidence which suggests that Xuandi himself was not entirely on board for everything the reformers stood for. This dilemma is most visible in the realms of administration and justice, so let's look at those. Reformists thought that Confucian scholars were the ideal sort of person to fill out the government bureaucracy, believing that a good education in the classics would provide a man with the moral fibre necessary for a benevolent government. Xuandi, however, when choosing officials, emphasised the need for practical experience. This was a principle that was more in line with modernist or legalist thinking. Xuandi has been credited as one of the more impactful emperors of the Han Dynasty when it came to the style of government. In the same way that we can talk about Wendi promoting a lenient, easygoing government, and talk about Wudi facilitating a more penetrating style, Xuandi had his own unique ideas about how the law should work and how officials should interact with the people. What we see at the end is a curious mixture of Confucian virtues and values, with a keenly pragmatic approach. Xuandi was perhaps more personally involved in government than any emperor since Gaodi. We already saw how he curtailed the power of the Secretariat by asking that memorials be directly submitted to him, as part of the strategy to diminish the wars. Xuandi was also famous for upholding members of government to high standards and personally evaluating them. He would interview candidates for important offices himself, and often stressed the necessity of capable officials. However, modern historians have had some different views about what exact qualities Xuandi was looking for in his appointments. Homer H. Dubs considers generosity and leniency to have been Xuandi's priority. He considers the 4 men Xuandi appointed as Chancellor after the death of Huo Guang. With the exception of Wei Xiang, whose, quoting Dubs, stern and severe hand was necessary to bring down the Huo family, they were all renowned for their beneficence. Dubs describes Bing Ji, that prison governor who had saved Xuandi's life, and who succeeded to the chancellorship in 59 BC, as, quote, good-natured and liberal. Bing's successor, Huang Ba, appointed in 55, had displayed his, quote, generosity and fairness when deciding legal cases in his role as governor of Henan. The final chancellor, Yu Dingguo, appointed in 51, was known to be kindly to widows, and to give to the accused the benefit of the doubt when deciding trials. Dubs notes that all these chancellors had at least dabbled in Confucianism, suggesting they believed in government by virtue, even if they were not all career scholars. Michael Lowe, on the other hand, questions the idea that Xuandi promoted this sort of laid-back, magnanimous beneficence. He points to a passage in the chapter on Xuandi's son, Xuandi, which supposedly records a conversation between the two while Xuandi was emperor. In this passage, Xuandi is skeptical of the Confucian philosophy of government. The passage begins when Xuandi's son criticizes him. Quote, Your Majesty is too severe in applying the laws. It would be proper to employ Confucian masters in your government. Empress Xuan changed colour and said, The Han dynasty has its own institutes and laws, which are variously taken from the ways of the Lord Protector and the ideal kings. The Lords Protectors were the hegemons, or Ba, of the Warring States era. In Mencius, they were contrasted with the ideal kings of Zhou, the latter being upheld as the symbol of Confucian-style government. How could I trust purely to moral instruction, and use the kind of government exercised by the Zhou dynasty? The vulgar Confucians, moreover, do not understand what is appropriate to the time. They love to approve the ancient and disapprove the present, making people to be confused about names and realities, so they do not know what they should cherish. How could they be capable of being entrusted with responsibility? Lowe considers the disparity between this apparent confession of Xuandi's true beliefs and the actual style of government in his reign, the sorts of people appointed to senior positions and the reformist policies, as a sign that perhaps Xuandi did not have as much of a hand on governance as has traditionally been thought. Historian Liang Cai offers a slightly different third view, which may help us reconcile some of these difficulties. With her statistical analysis of the ideologies and backgrounds of senior officials, we can see that there was clearly a preponderance of Confucian officials, as Dubs noted. Of the 25 officials who can be identified that were appointed after the death of Huo Guang, 12, nearly half, were Confucians. However, Xuandi was also insistent that his most important officials be experienced administrators. Liang uses the case of Xiao Wangji to illustrate this insistence on experience. Xiao Wangji was a superintendent of the Lesser Treasury, and because of his study in Confucian classics and his skill as a debater, Xuandi was considering appointing him as chancellor. However, he wanted to test Xiao Wangji's skill as an administrator first, so he assigned Xiao to be the left metropolitan superintendent, the governor of the western division of the capital region. Xiao considered this a demotion from his post as superintendent of the Lesser Treasury, and was worried that his career might be over. Xuandi sent him a messenger to reassure him, saying, quote, "Those the emperor employed as eminent officials all had experience administering local regions. That was how they proved their ability. Since you acted as governor of Pingyuan for only a short time, the emperor wanted to test your administrative ability once again. That is why he put you in charge of the capital area." The emphasis on administrative experience may have helped to develop the idea of Xuandi as more practically minded, with no time for idealistic Confucians. But men with experience in Confucianists were not mutually exclusive groups. 8 men who reached senior positions under Xuandi had started off as scholars, but 5 of these also worked their way up to their positions by cultivating experience in the bureaucracy. There were also 4, including 3 of those chancellors I mentioned before, Bing Ji, Huang Ba, and Yu Dingguo, who started studying classics only after they had begun their careers as officials. Perhaps this overlap is a testament to Huo Guang's injection of Confucianism into politics, and that the skills of classicists were becoming more important in government. Another area where we see hints of philosophical competition was in the justice system. Xuandi involved himself here as much as in the administrative sphere. His first major intervention into the judiciary was in the winter of 67-6 BC, the year after Huo Guang's death. He established 4 referees for the superintendent of trials, out of concern that judges were afraid of declaring not guilty verdicts. He himself started to make a habit of visiting the court buildings in the capital, where he often utilized his position as the ultimate judicial authority in China, deciding cases himself. He iterated his personal interest in law in an edict from the following summer, 66, wherein he asked that special care be taken in cases where people had obstructed the course of justice to protect their family members. The law treated those who concealed the crimes of their loved ones as guilty of the same crime. Xuandi changed this situation so that when a, for lack of a better word, inferior family member protected a superior, such as a child protecting a parent or a wife protecting a husband, the action would not be considered criminal, and when a superior family member acted on behalf of an inferior and had been sentenced to death, the case should be, quote, referred to the superintendent of trials in order that they may be reported to us, so that Xuandi could give them some leniency. If you stretch your memory back to the episodes on Qin, we talked about the problem of family members concealing crimes to illustrate a point of difference between Confucianism and legalism. While Confucianist ethics praised the father who concealed the misdeeds of his son, legalists praised those who informed on their family members. and in fact, this point had come up in the Sultanine discourses in Xuandi's reign. The reformists had criticised the laws which condemned a family member trying to protect their child, quoting the same passage from the Analects of Confucius that I used in that episode. Here's what they said from the discourses. Quote, "From the time that the law was established that those who take the lead in hiding a criminal should be condemned as his accomplices, consideration for one's flesh and blood was destroyed, and as a result, punishments and crimes have been more numerous. We have been taught that although a child may have committed a crime, a father and a mother will nevertheless hide their child. Why is it that they do not want their child to suffer punishment? It is because a son will screen his father and a father will screen his son. We have not been taught that a father and son should be considered accomplices of each other in crime." So, in abrogating this law, Xuandi was fulfilling the desires of the reformists. Interestingly though, 2 years later, in spring 64 BC, he issued an edict which seems to advocate a more legalist style of judging, at the same time justifying the call with a classical citation. Quote, "The book of history says, 'You must deal speedily with them according to the penal laws made by King Wen, punishing them severely and not pardoning them. But now the officials, in cultivating their persons and in upholding the laws, have not yet conformed to our conceptions. We are very much troubled by it.'" He then granted an amnesty to allow time for the officials to reflect on their methods. The call for swift and severe punishment seems more like something Shang Yang would advocate than Confucius, and it's interesting to see Xuandi use one of the classics upheld by the Confucians to justify an apparently legalist judicial doctrine. In the summer of that year, Xuandi issued an edict which asked senior officials to be careful not to hire corrupt people to judge legal cases, and condemned corruption more broadly in the bureaucracy. It shows how seriously Xuandi viewed the legal system, and how important it was to him that his subjects trusted it. Part of it reads, quote, "Criminal trials are that on which the fate of the myriad common people hangs. They are the means of arresting violence and of stopping evil, of rearing and developing all living beings. If anyone can make the living be without cause of resentment against him, and the dead whom he has sentenced be without hatred for him, he may indeed be called an accomplished official. But the present officials are not such persons. In applying the law, some of them cherish deceptive intentions, juggling the law in either direction that suits them, making their unjust decisions too heavy or too light, adding statements to cover up their own wrongdoing, using such statements to encompass the guilt of the accused. When they memorialize what is not according to the facts, the emperor has, moreover, no means of knowing the truth." Overall, when it came to the justice system, it seems Xuandi was most concerned that his officials upheld the law and did not twist trial outcomes to serve their own ends. It appears he looked for a balance between lenience and severity. In one of his final edicts, from 49 BC, he lamented that some of his officials, in the name of clemency, were not adequately punishing crime, while others acted tyrannously. Quote, "Since we are unintelligent, we have several times made known in our edicts to the ministers and grandees that they ought to practice clemency and generosity, and suit their actions to the sufferings and bitternesses of the common people, because we wish to equal the high attainment of the three kings, and to manifest the virtue of our imperial predecessors. But now some officials have thought that not prohibiting wickedness and evil constitutes clemency and generosity, and that setting free or dismissing criminals constitutes the absence of tyranny, whereas some consider that tyranny and evildoing constitute capability. All of these persons have failed to attain the true mean." There are some other domestic policy type things which shed light on the ideas going through the heads of the men in Chang'an. One such thing was the bestowal of social ranks, the manner of which may be another indication of Confucian thinking. The system of ranks had been inherited from Qin, where it had been used as an instrument for rewarding merit, in accordance with legalist governing philosophy. To this end, they were usually awarded on an individual basis for things like military accomplishments, or else they were made available for sale. For us, the idea of selling ranks might seem inconsistent with meritocracy, but when you consider that the merit they were trying to encourage was the provision of services to the government, then you can understand why giving the government a heap of cash could be considered a worthy act. In the Han, As well as ranks being available through these methods, it became common to make general bestowals, awarding the entire population a step up in rank. Such bestowals were usually made in recognition of the accession of an emperor, the nomination of an empress or a crown prince, religious ceremonies, and other such occasions, but there were no formal procedures preventing an emperor from awarding them just because. These types of general bestowals were not congruent with the philosophy of rewarding merit, because they were made without reference to any particular individual's accomplishments. Throughout the Han Dynasty, the frequency of these general bestowals could vary greatly. In the earlier period of Gaodi, Huidi, and Empress Liu, and under Jingdi, they had been quite common, but under Wendi and Wudi they were fairly rare. However, Xuandi's reign saw the frequency of general bestowals brought to a whole new level. In his 25-year-long reign, there were 12 general bestowals, more than any previous emperor, and at a rate of one bestowal every 2.08 years, more often than any previous emperor except for Jingdi, who awarded them at a rate of one every 2 years. In the previous 129 years of the Han Dynasty, there had been 22 general bestowals. In less than a fifth of that time, Xuandi had made more than half that number. Historian Michael Lowe says that Confucian governing philosophy can partially explain the increase in the frequency of these bestowals. In the Confucian view, the social ranks were not so much for rewarding merit as for displaying the generosity and benevolence of the government. General bestowals upon the whole population were a great way for an emperor to show his magnanimous virtue, and if that came at the cost of diluting the value of social ranks, and thus impairing their usefulness in encouraging merit, well, that just shows what was considered more important. By the way, you might be wondering why in Jingdi's reign, general bestowals were even more frequent than in Xuandi's. Well, so was everyone else. In Jingdi's 16-year reign, there were 8 bestowals. This could partly be explained by the succession disputes. In his reign, there were 2 occasions in which a crown prince was nominated, both of which were marked by general bestowals. Jingdi also had a penchant for making bestowals when he made his sons into kings of feudal states. Previous emperors had not marked such occasions with bestowals of rank, but it's uncertain why Jingdi liked to mark the enthronement of his sons in this way. Another interesting question is how Xuandi's government associated itself with the legacy of the Wudi era. On one hand, the Wudi era had been a defining moment for the country. The lands that Xuandi was now colonising had been inherited from Wudi's conquests, and the men coming out of the Imperial Academy and recommendation system that had been instituted by Wudi were by now reaching their way to the highest levels of government. On the other hand, Wudi's reign had been the high watermark for modernist policies, and for a country now going in a different direction, it may have been desirable to distance the government from that period. One step that celebrated Wudi came in 72 BC, when it was decided to honour Wudi's memory by granting him more elaborate funeral ceremonies. Jingdi had elevated Gaodi and Wendi by granting them the temple names Great Founder and Great Patriarch respectively, in Chinese, Taizu and Taizong, creating new dances for their rituals and building temples for them all throughout the country. Not every emperor received a temple name. In the Western Han, they were usually reserved to emperors who had left an especially important impact on the dynasty. Now Wudi too received the same treatment. He was given the temple name Eternal Patriarch, Shizong. Special dances were included in the rites, and temples were built for him in commanderies that he had visited. The edict announcing this decision included a paragraph praising Wudi's achievements. Quote, "Early and late, we have been thinking and reflecting that Empress Xiao Wu personally practiced benevolence and righteousness, and selected brilliant generals to punish those who did not submit, so that the Xiongnu fled afar. Those generals pacified the Diqiang, so that the states of Kunming, Nanyue, and the many southern barbarians turned towards his influence, knocked at the barriers, and brought tribute. He established the Imperial University, renewed the suburban and other sacrifices, fixed the beginning of the year, harmonized the musical notes and musical tubes, performed the sacrifice Feng upon Mount Tai, and made the Swan Fang Dike. Auspicious portents and presages came in response. The precious 3-legged cauldron appeared, and the white unicorn was captured. His merits and virtue are glorious and abundant, so that they cannot be completely related." Because this happened before Huoguang died, It's not clear whether the idea came from him or from Xuandi. Perhaps it was important for both of them to emphasise Wudi's achievements. After all, being Wudi's great-grandson was Xuandi's only real claim to the throne, and at that point, both Hua and Xuandi benefited from proving that Xuandi was a legitimate successor. On the other hand, a step which may have been made to signal a reaction against Wudi's era was compensation paid to the heirs of marquisates which had been disestablished by Wudi in 112 BC. Wudi had demoted over 100 marquises whose fiefdoms had been passed down since Gaozu's time, probably because he considered them unnecessary, and because the men who held them had not done anything to earn their positions. Under Xuandi, in 65 BC, a search was made for the would-have-been heirs of the disestablished marquisates, and they were compensated with a tax exemption, and a few years later were granted some gold. If this apparent twisting and turning over the legacy of Wudi tells us anything, it's that, like any government, there were a lot of different ideas in Chang'an about what the Han should and shouldn't be doing. The final topic to discuss is intellectual and religious developments. Xuandi's reign was notable for how natural disasters were perceived. We mentioned in episode 9, Wudi's China, that the Confucian philosopher Dong Zhongshu advanced the theory that earthquakes, floods, and solar eclipses were signs that there was something wrong with the policy of the empire. Wudi had not really embraced this idea. Although he sometimes connected disasters to failings in his own personal virtue, he became angry when people used the disasters to criticize his policies. Prior to Wudi and Dong Zhongshu, Wendi had occasionally reflected upon the connection between natural disasters and politics, but after his reign, subsequent emperors had rarely linked the two, if they commented on these occurrences at all. This all changed in Xuandi's reign, when it became commonplace for imperial edicts to be issued in response to disasters, and for these edicts to blame the disasters on political mistakes. By my count, there were 4 instances in Xuandi's reign, where imperial edicts either invited criticism in the wake of a natural disaster, or where they blamed some particular fault of governance for a recent calamity. The instances occurred both before and after Huoguang's death. An example of inviting criticism occurred in the summer of 70 BC, following earthquakes and flooding in and around the Shandong Peninsula. The edict reads in part, quote, "Verily, calamitous visitations and prodigies are warnings from heaven and earth. Let the Chancellor, Wei Xian, and the Imperial Councillor, Wei Xiang, together with the marquises and officials ranking at fully 2,000 pickles, widely question those gentlemen who are learned in the classics, to see whether there is anything to do in response to this calamity, and thereby assist our inadequacies. Let nothing be hidden from us. We order that the 3 adjuncts, the superintendent of ceremonial, and the inner commanderies and kingdoms, each recommend one capable and good person who is sincere and upright. If in the code or ordinances there is anything that should be abolished and done away with, in order to give peace to the people, let those articles of the law be memorialized." In 54 BC, after a solar eclipse, an edict explicitly laid the blame on appointing inappropriate officials, and an investigation was made to ferret out those who, quote, "arbitrarily make tyrannous prohibitions, are extremely exacting, and have not reformed themselves." If Xuandi was more attuned than previous emperors to the links between calamities and policy mistakes, the flip side of this was the special attention granted to positive omens. Unlike the natural disaster political failure connection, it had been fairly common for previous emperors to recognise auspicious omens and celebrate them with various rewards to the people. However, Xuandi celebrated omens at an unprecedented rate. By my count, there are 14 good omens recorded in his chapter in the Book of Han, 11 of which were celebrated by rewards to the people, usually an amnesty. Perhaps the most fabulous instance was in 61, when a number of auspicious sights were reported, including a golden fungus of immortality, supernatural birds and fish, a white tiger, a male phoenix, and black millet. In celebration, the common people were granted 1 step in rank, the officials 2 steps, and ox and wine were given to every 100 households, silk to widows, orphans, childless, and the elderly. Welfare debts to the government were cancelled, and places where the emperor had travelled through were exempted from the land tax. Historian Homer H. Stubbs has an interesting line about positive omens in Xuandi's reign. He says that, in light of the generally good state of affairs for the common people at that time, i.e., limited warfare, good crops, and a generous government, quote, It is not surprising that, as a consequence of these benefits, the people should have seen many portents from heaven. Phoenixes, supernatural birds, sweet dew, dragons, and other marvels appeared. Upon each such report, Empress Xuan distributed favours, amnesties, noble ranks, oxen and wine, silk. It is consequently natural that reports of portents should have been frequent. The people, who credited even the good weather to beneficent government, doubtlessly considered Empress Xuan worthy of all these portents and more. He seems to be suggesting both that people cynically took advantage of Xuandi's tendency to reward good signs by falsely reporting them, but also that there may have been some sort of psychological effect, where the happy state of the empire made it more likely for people to genuinely believe that they had witnessed positive supernatural occurrences. On the intellectual side of things, there was one especially important event in Xuandi's reign, which were the discussions at the Pavilion of the Stone Canal in 51 BC. This was the culmination of a series of conferences, which were to nut out which interpretations of the established classics should be considered canonical. There were various interpretations of the different classics, with scholars specialising in one interpretation or another. Thus, when scholars were selected as official academicians, the government could privilege one interpretation above others. The important outcomes of the conference were that the Guliang commentary of the Spring and Autumn Annals was given preference over the Gongyang commentary, and the number of imperial academicians was increased. The Gongyang had been the favoured interpretation of the annals since the days of Wu Di. Both Dong Zhongshu and the Chancellor Gongsun Hong had been students of it. However, Xuandi had a personal connection to the Guliang, for he had heard that his grandfather, Liu Ju, the heir apparent of Wu Di who had died in the witch trials, had enjoyed that commentary. Furthermore, the Guliang had originated in the area of China known as Lu, and many of Xuandi's ministers hailed from that region. According to the Book of Han, Xuandi was personally active in the debates. He, quote, attended upon the discussions and decided their disputes. Aside from the intellectual importance of the event, which admittedly is a bit beyond my understanding, it had political significance as well. Many of the Confucian scholars who participated in the discussions went on to be important statesmen under later emperors. By the count of historian Liang Cai, of 14 named participants, 6 later rose to become one of the 3 excellencies or 9 ministers, and at least 10 disciples of the participants eventually reached those positions. Thus, the Pavilion of the Stone Canal discussions were an important moment for the spread of Confucianism into the bureaucracy. Xuandi died on the day Jia Su of the 12th month of the year Huanglong, the 10th of January, 49 BC. He was still a bit young, in his 43rd year, but no reason is given for his death. Historians, both ancient and modern, have been fairly positive in their assessment of Xuandi. He is often portrayed as the last great emperor of Western Han. Bangu compared Xuandi to Wu Ding of the Shang dynasty and King Xuan of the Zhou dynasty, both rulers who had successfully attacked barbarian tribes. He says that Xuandi's reign constituted the, quote, renaissance of the dynasty, highlighting his capable and effective administration, particularly his choice of officials and the submission of Shan Yu Hu Hanye. Ban also says that subsequent emperors were unable to match Xuandi's achievements, which gives that feeling of him being the last great emperor. Wang Chong, a contemporary of Bangu, praised Xuandi even more highly, describing him as the equal of Yao and Shun, 2 of the legendary sage emperors of the ancient past. He said, quote, the world was completely peaceful. For 10,000 li in all directions, people strove to progress, and the doctrine of benevolent love was put into practice. Among modern historians, Homer H. Dubs esteems Xuandi at similar levels, saying, quote, he was the best ruler of the whole former Han period. Dubs emphasises Xuandi's style of governance, pointing to his personal involvement with administration and his generosity to the people, particularly in the rewards he meted out in response to omens. Amateur historian Sunny Yao Yang praises his diligence in fighting corruption. Michael Lowe credits his, quote, strength of mind in disempowering the Huo family. René Grousset lauds him as the inheritor of Wu Di's legacy, looking at his foreign policy achievements, the colonization of the western regions, and the submission of Shan Yu Hu Hanye. Grousset also seems to share the view that he was the last great emperor of the Western Han, viewing the subsequent emperors as increasingly degenerate. The traditional narrative of Xuandi being the last great has been questioned though. In particular, a recent volume from 2015, Chang'an 26 BCE, edited by Michael Nyland and Gria van Kierbergen, focuses on the reign of Xuandi's grandson, Chengdi, and seeks to show that at that time the Han dynasty was still flourishing, and compares the achievements of that emperor to those of Roman emperors Augustus and Hadrian. Moreover, as I've already pointed out, some question whether Xuandi had as much of a grip on government as is usually thought. While there are those who interpret the apparent contradiction between Xuandi's personal legalist modernist beliefs and the Confucian reformist direction of his rule as a sign that he, in the words of Sunny Yao Yang, quote, insisted on balancing legalist and Confucian ideas, others see things differently. Michael Lowe, after considering the discrepancy, says, quote, it would seem that the change toward the new outlook, that is, the reformist policies, may have developed without the emperor's entire approval, and despite some of his own preferences. Even if there are some quibbles over how much Xuandi actually directed government, I think most agree, myself included, that his goals of keeping his government minimally corrupt and his legal system fair, and the personal effort he put into trying to meet those goals, were highly admirable. As always, thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed it, I'd love to hear some feedback. You can email me at offspin-history@tutornoda.com or use the chat box on my website, offspinhistory.wordpress.com. You can leave a review on iTunes, although I won't see it. I don't get notified about those kind of things. So far, it's looking like the next episode will be on my usual 2-weekly schedule, but after that, I think there'll probably be a delay, and I'm not sure when the episode after that will come out. But anyway, if you stick around and listen to those, that's means a lot. As always, I'm not a historian or an academic, and I don't speak Chinese. And I do these just for fun. And I'd like to thank Professor Xuandi Yu of Northeastern University for letting me use his music from the album Guqin Music, The Vibrant Rhythm of Ancient Heroes.